There's 5 people. This is the point. No one knows about this Land Claims Commission because it's operating from wherever. And I understand its budget is about R1 billion. And this is the body that is meant to be settling all of these land claims. But it is the most dysfunctional of all of the government agencies. So when we talk about, these white people are not playing ball, the problem is that we've got our institutions that themselves are not performing according to their constitutional function. So these are the 4 problems that I've experienced in relation to land reform. There's the question of resources and the burden of proof of having to establish all of these claims. There is the problem of greedy landowners, which is also aided and abetted by our own government. There is a problem of bureaucracy and the problem of the legalism of the entire process. But as I say, restitution is not everything. Another leg is redistribution. So we tend to speak more about restitution and we put all of our eggs in the basket of restitution. But I suggest to you that restitution is not going to resolve the problems of landlessness in South Africa because as the year goes past, very, very few people will be able to establish claims under the restitution framework. So which means that if we are going to look for an equitable system, we have to be looking at a leg other than restitution. Because restitution is for anyone who can prove their claim after the 19th of June 1913. But once those claims are all settled, the problem of landlessness will persist. Because the land was not taken in 1913, it was taken before 1913. So there will still be a large number of blacks that are unable to access land. But that is also provided for in the Constitution under the redistribution framework. There is a duty on the government to ensure that there is redistribution. They even have the instrument for it. You know what it's called? The EFF would love this, expropriation. Not without compensation. But so if one actually is interested in a thoroughgoing program of land reform, sometimes we should forget about restitution and the fact that it is a judicial process and think more about redistribution. And here, we have a constitution that enables the government to expropriate land. And in 2007, 2008, I was asked by Thabo Mbeki's government, by Thoko Didiza, to draft an expropriation legislation, which I did. I gave it to them, but they never passed it. No one knows the story. But so it's our little. But the truth of the matter is that I gave them the draft in 2008. The cabinet passed it. It was never passed in Parliament. Now suddenly Jeremy Cronin, I see, is now going around with this new 2015. But Jacob Zuma has refused to sign it. Now you can ask yourself the question: the government has the instruments to implement redistribution through an expropriation framework. Since 2007 or 2008, when they asked me at the time to draft this act, what have they done about it? Because we have an expropriation act which is 1977 or 78, I can't even remember. Now, 75, you see, there's someone who knows the expropriation act. I don't know how many of you knew when the expropriation act was passed. Okay, I can tell you it's 1975, I've just been told. But there could have been a new expropriation act in 2008 already. The government did not pass it. It has no excuse for not passing it. So again, if the EFF wants to make a demand, it should ask the government the right question. Well, why have you not passed the expropriation act since 2008? Because that's when you got the first draft. But they quickly abandoned the draft, and there were so many rumors about why the draft was abandoned, and also about meetings held in dark-lit rooms with the agents of WMC. And then, yes, then there is the third level of land reform, and this is what is called security of tenure. Now, with security of tenure, we all know that black people were for a long, long time not allowed to own property, but one of the instruments for land reform was that there should be security of tenure. And here, tenure is threatened at various levels. One is anyone who comes from the villages of Natal, of Zululand, will know that Amorphous body called Ingonyama Trust. Yeah, well, Silo Samabanda is in charge. Anyway, I saw that the CIC was
Of course.
hanging out with Ingonya. Anyway, so no criticism at all. But the point is that what the consequences of that regime are, these are replicated. I mean, I use Ingonyama Trust because it's probably the most known and maybe the most notorious example of how individuals at household level have no security of tenure because the power for the control of the land is concentrated where in chiefs. Now, a lot of people have a fundamental misconception about this role of the chiefs. Everyone will say, oh, well, Inkosi is part of our tradition. There's no such tradition. Inkosi ngabantu. So the system, the proper traditional system has always been bottom up. Yes. So if you did not do your job properly, you were always removed.
Yes.
What happened is that through the system of Theophilus Shapstein in Natal, the system of indirect rule was introduced. Every community of blacks had to be organized into what was called a kraal. And each kraal had to have a head, and each head had to belong in Amabuto, etc., etc. But what essentially that system meant is that white people could not deal with this amorphous group of blacks, and they wanted someone like Induna that they could channel their instructions. So the book is called Mamhood Mamdani it's called, Political Science Students, Citizen and Subject. So that book explains to you the entire system of Sir Theophilus Shapstein. We see that system replicated everywhere in the country. So this idea when people say, oh, well, Ingozi is like, where did he come from to call himself Ingozi? So he comes from below up. That is the traditional system. So what we now have is because we've taken all of these colonial systems and we've made them part and parcel of our system. So when we talk tenure reform, we should be talking about how we actually empower communities living under the leadership of chiefs. All right. Now, let me go back to where I began. How should we then start a new discourse on land? So I suggest perhaps 5 areas that we should be exploring when we talk about what is the new decolonized discourse on land. So I think the first is to deal with something I haven't addressed in my talk, which is to confront the masculinity in the discourses of land. You know what You know what the actual percentage of land that has been restituted, that has gone to women? It's 23%. Only 23% of land that has come through redistribution has gone to women. Yet, the Freedom Charter says the land belongs to all those who work it. And who works the land? It is women who work the land. So why is the discourse so muscular? Why has land reform not benefited women? Why has land reform benefited men? So I suggest the first question we have to deal with is how to resolve the problem of masculinity. Even in discussions about occupation, conversation is such a muscular conversation.
Yes.
So I suggest that is the first area that we have to be trying to resolve. And we know this also historically. I grew up in a village. You know, a lot of people talk a lot of nonsense about villages. There were no men in the villages. The men were in the cities working in the mines.
Thank you.
So every household was run by a woman. So I mean, these ideas that if you go to the village and everyone is cooking for me, etc. It's just ridiculous. All right. So I think when we are talking about a decolonized discourse on land, I think that the problem of masculinity looms large. Unless we confront it, then we are, I think, kidding ourselves. Then the second issue that I suppose we must factor into is the question of how to resolve the power imbalances in communally owned land. So I make the example, power belongs to the people and it doesn't belong to the chiefs. The third area, this is what I call, like, how do we move beyond the slogans? So, for instance, the debate on land reform sometimes gets reduced into whether there should be payment or there should be no payment, whether the land should be taken by force or shouldn't be taken by force. So I suggest that to a large extent that debate is resolved. We know that not every piece of ground that is taken from private landowners should be paid for. And we know that there is no willing seller, willing buyer. We know that there is no market-based approaches to compensation. So the real debate is what form of a compensation regime do we want? I tried to address the issue when I gave a judgment which AfriForum and Agri-SA are very unhappy about. They've now appealed it to the Supreme Court of Appeal, etc. But the debate about land should not be confined to judicial institutions. The debate about land is a national discussion. So what kind of a regime of compensation are we actually talking about? If one actually looks at the factors, one of the factors that are in Section 25 is the historical acquisition of land. Now, we know the facts of history are so clear. A lot of these lands are just given to people for no compensation or no payment at all. So why then should, when our government takes the land, why should it pay compensation? So why should it not be the case that there will be some instances where there will be compensation, but it will be zero compensation? Because the Constitution makes it obligatory that there should be compensation, right? So don't leave that out of the equation. So, and then the fourth area I suggest that perhaps we should be looking at is how we look at land in economic terms. We now live in the 21st century economy. All of you have got all of these ideas. So a lot of people tell you, no, this land thing is an old thing. You know, we now live, we've got computers and stuff. You know, so how we integrate the discourses on land into the 21st century, so that you resolve this constant criticism when they tell you that, hey, if you talk about land, you are taking us backwards. You know, so because we know that land, in fact, is the economy. Agriculture remains an important source of the economy of this country. Anyone who tells you differently is lying. Even if it's not agriculture, it is the mines. The fact is that everything that moves in this country moves on land. Yes. So let no one tell you that land is an 18th century, 19th century conception. But it's up to us to think about how to integrate the conversation about land into the 21st century economy. And then lastly, I want to talk about land as what I call sort of cultural hegemony. So who owns the debate on land? And what language is used in the debate about land? So the point really I want to suggest is not whether we have the Constitution or we don't have the Constitution. I think we have no choice. We have the Constitution, and I think the only practical way forward is through the Constitution. But the hegemony about the meaning of the Constitution belongs to black people. So I suggest that we should not only demand the enforcement of the Constitution, but we should also own its very conception, so that it is an instrument that serves the concerns of black people. This is not, I want to suggest to you, an imposition or a new conception. My own book, okay, this is the last time I mentioned my book. My own book demonstrates this quite clearly, that when you look historically at how these concepts of the rule of law, these concepts of Thomas Hobbes, because mentioning Thomas Hobbes, don't start with Thomas Hobbes. But these concepts about having a system that is mentioned, that is ruled according to the rule of law, ultimately originate from black lawyers that lived in the early 19th century. Over time, they were appropriated or maybe misappropriated by white lawyers. So that shifted the control of the discourses. And I suggest that if we are to take this seriously, we should think about land as part and parcel of our own cultural hegemony. Thank you.